Can't show it though.
Pleasure to introduce to you our speaker this evening. Our speaker is Father Frank Brennan SJ AO. He is the Rector of Newman College at the University of Melbourne. Father Frank is a distinguished fellow of the PM Glynn Institute at the Australian Catholic University and an adjunct professor at the Thomas More Law School at ACU. He is the author of numerous books on human rights, having chaired the Australian Government's 2009 National Human Rights Consultation and having been a member of the Australian Government's 2018 Religious Freedom Review. He has most recently served on the Australian Government's Senior Advisory Group designing a proposed Indigenous voice for the First Nations peoples in Australia. Father Frank Brennan will tonight deliver the 16th Annual St Thomas More Oration. The title is The Pell Case, Lessons for Church and State. Would you welcome Father Frank?
Bill Mason, Father Emil, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation to return and to address another Thomas More Forum. I've entitled tonight's address, Lessons for Church and State from the Pell Saga. First, the example of Thomas More. When Pope John Paul declared Thomas More a patron of statesmen and politicians, he said, "Whenever men or women heed the call of truth, their conscience then guides their actions reliably towards good. Precisely because of the witness which he bore, even at the price of his life, to the primacy of truth over power." St Thomas More is venerated as an imperishable example of moral integrity. Tonight, I want to draw lessons from the Pell Saga, heeding the call to truth, asserting the primacy of truth over power, working to enhance the place of legitimate authority and institutions which are to be administered not for the sake of power, but to seek the supreme ideal of justice, always having an eye for the one who is weak or poor, attempting to deal with the most intense of social controversies with a sense of fairness. Second, the example of Cardinal Marx and Pope Francis. As you know, we as a church have been confronting enormous things in relation to child sexual abuse in the church as an institution. In May, Cardinal Marx of Munich wrote to Pope Francis saying, "It's important to me to share the responsibility for the catastrophe of the sexual abuse by church officials over the past decades. The investigations and reports of the last 10 years have consistently shown that there have been many personal failures and administrative mistakes, but also institutional or systemic failure." Pope Francis responded earlier this month saying, "The whole church is in crisis because of the abuse issue. Furthermore, the church today cannot take a step forward without assuming this crisis. The ostrich policy does not lead to anything, and the crisis has to be assumed from our Easter faith. Assuming the crisis personally and communally is the only fruitful path. So I come to consider the case of Cardinal George Pell. This case impacted most on two individuals, one who is simply known by the initial J, the complainant, and the other, George Pell. None of us knows the identity of the complainant in the Pell proceedings, nor should we. When the High Court acquitted Cardinal Pell of all charges, the complainant J issued a statement through his lawyer saying, "My journey has been long and I am relieved that it's over. I have my ups and downs. The darkness is never far away. Despite the stress of the legal process and public controversy, I've tried hard to keep myself together. I'm okay. I hope that everyone who's followed this case is okay." Earlier, his lawyer had told national television, "My client had a very long journey. The criminal process has been quite stressful for him, and it's not over yet. Like many survivors, my client has experienced depression, loneliness, struggle with various issues over time." Cardinal Pell walked free after 404 days in prison, most often solitary confinement. When the High Court acquitted him of all charges, he said, "I hold no ill will towards my accuser. I do not want my acquittal to add to the hurt and bitterness so many feel. There is certainly hurt and bitterness enough. The only basis for long-term healing is truth, and the only basis for justice is truth, because justice means truth for all." So I think it behoves us to hold both J and Pell clearly in our sights tonight. So, how did I become involved? Back in 2012, I was giving an address at Parliament House in Sydney, the Law and Justice Oration. And I said, clearly the Church itself cannot be left alone to get its house in order. I thought the Catholic Church needed the assistance of the state to deal with the issues of child sexual abuse and the failures that had followed institutionally. As all of you would know, Cardinal Pell and I had had our differences, and that's to put it mildly. There had been a case running about the late Archbishop Wilson, and I thought he was acting with poor advice. And when it was clear that any proceedings against Pell were going to be run with suppression orders in place, I was very worried. I had grounds, as I will say later, to be very concerned about the approach of the Victoria Police towards the Catholic Church, but particularly towards George Pell in particular. And that being the case, I wrote to Cardinal Pell and I suggested that if he were to be facing trial under suppression orders, where the public would not know day to day what was occurring, it was essential that there be someone who'd be in a position to inform the public, particularly Catholics of goodwill. Basically, I didn't think it should be left just to the ABC and to a few other media outlets. And I suggested that he commission the services of a retired county court judge. In his inimitable style, he came back to me. He said, "I've spoken to my people and we think it'd be better to have you. You'll go over better with the literati and the glitterati." And so it was arranged that I would play a role, not at the request of Pell, but at the request of the President and Vice President of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, where they formally approached the Jesuit Provincial asking for my services to be available to attend what I could of the trials, and the thing was that Pell was to give me access as he did to the transcripts. and so I had access to all transcripts except, of course, the transcript of the complainant giving his evidence. But you will appreciate that all, if not all, most of the key evidence of the complainant was either put by the prosecution or the defence to other witnesses, or in their final addresses, or in the judgments of the appeal court judges. It was also decided that I would check in regularly with a very esteemed senior QC of the Melbourne Bar, and so day to day as the trial progressed, I would check things out with that QC. I had quite good relationships with quite a number of professional journalists who were covering the proceedings, and was able to answer some of their queries about the strange nature of a solemn 11 a.m. Mass. But I do have to say and disclose that I had nothing to do with the three major book writers, simply because none of them ever approached me. In fact, you might be aware, one of them even wrote that I was in the courtroom when the verdict was delivered, and I was 1,000 kilometres away in Bathurst. So I think that having attended the proceedings, what's for the good of everyone, including Jay and Pell and everyone else who's watched these proceedings, it's now time to declare that truth is the only way to go. It's time to declare that Pell is innocent of the preposterous charges he faced in the County Court of Victoria, and a lot of grief for everyone, including Jay, could have been avoided if there had been competent policing, and if there had been competent work by the DPP, and if the Victorian Court of Appeal had given a judgment in line with the dissenting judgment of Mark Weinberg, the leading criminal appeal judge in the country, or with all 7 judges of the highest court in the land. So this is why I've published the book Observations on the Pell Proceedings, so you can make your own assessment of the evidence. The book is dedicated to those who seek truth, justice and healing, and to those who have been denied them. Having followed the Pell proceedings closely, I'm convinced that the case did nothing to help bona fide complainants. It did nothing to help victims and their supporters. I write in the introduction, the failures of the Victorian police, prosecution authorities, and the 2 most senior Victorian judges in these proceedings did nothing to help the efforts being made to address the trauma of institutional child sexual abuse. As a society, we need to do better, and the legal system needs to play its part. So, what was the background? Basically, Victoria Police charged Pell with 26 offences at the outset. 6 of those charges were withdrawn before the committal proceedings. At the committal, the committing magistrate discharged Pell on a further 10 charges, so committed him on 10 remaining charges. Those 10 remaining charges included 7 charges in what was alleged to have occurred in St Patrick's Cathedral, and 3 charges of what was alleged to have occurred in the Ballarat pool. The first moment I smelt a real rat in these proceedings was the DPP was intending to proceed with the Ballarat pool case first, when every prosecutorial principle pointed to dealing with the St Patrick's Cathedral more serious charges first, where there were very aged witnesses. With the elapsing of time, they would not have been available, and that would have disadvantaged the defendant. It took the defence to put a formal submission that the DPP do its job and apply the honourable principles of prosecution, and so then the Cathedral case was heard first. Ultimately, the Ballarat cases fell over completely because, as the County Court judge wrote, there's a limit to what the law allows. It's one thing to strengthen or reinforce individual complaints through the lens of the collective weight of the complaints. It's quite another to seek to cure fundamental defects and weaknesses, or to change or obscure a complaint's essential character. So those charges fell over. By the time Pell had come to trial on the St Patrick's case, there were 5 remaining charges, 4 of which related to an event that was said to have occurred in the priest's sacristy after solemn 11 a.m. Mass, either on the 15th of December 1996 or the 22nd of December 1996. Now, when we come to consider the truth of the innocence of George Pell, bear this in mind. He was interviewed in Rome on the 19th of October 2016. Let me quote to you what he said to the police. Now, bear in mind, Mr. Ashton, the Victorian Police Commissioner, sent none other than his trusted deputy, Shane Patton, who is now the Commissioner of Police of Victoria, sent him to Rome to oversee the investigation in Rome. And in the record of interview in Rome, this is what Pell said. The most rudimentary interview of staff and those who were choir boys at the cathedral in that year and later would confirm that the allegations are fundamentally improbable and most certainly false. And I invite my interviewers to tell me who they've spoken to, and I'm happy to provide them in due course the persons who can speak authoritatively about my functions, presence and conduct at the cathedral generally, and more particularly at times when abuse is alleged to have occurred. I would earnestly hope that this is done before any decision is made whether to lay charges, because immeasurable damage will be done to me and to the Church by the mere laying of charges which on proper examination will later be found to be untrue. And he ended by saying, "Thank you." Now, let's look at a number of vital pieces of evidence from the Pell record of interview. I'm going to focus tonight on the record of interview of Pell in October 2016 because basically it mirrors almost to a sentence the judgment of the 7 judges of the High Court of Australia years later in April 2020. So, on your table there, you have the list of the raffle prizes, this being a good Catholic event. On the other side of the raffle prizes, you will find a map. The map highlights why I think this case has always been very simple and quite preposterous. So, if you look at that map, those of you who are familiar with a solemn mass in a cathedral, and I can assure you that many of the lawyers in the court were not familiar, and I can assure you that many of the media were completely and utterly unfamiliar. We don't do Catholic stuff. If it were a military parade, they'd have learnt it. They'd say, we've got to get on top of this. This is a military parade. But this is church stuff? No, we don't do church stuff. So what would happen usually after an 11 a.m. Mass? At the end of Mass, here's the sanctuary. There would be, as you know, a procession. At the head of the procession would be a number of altar servers, would there not? A cross bearer, 2 candle bearers, and probably a couple of others. And then after them would come 50 to 60 choristers. And after them would come any concelebrants, concelebrating priests, and the master of ceremonies, and ultimately there would come the archbishop with a mitre, the funny hat, and the crozier, a very sacred and very expensive piece of equipment, which you just don't leave lying around. And he would be accompanied by 2 additional servers, a mitre bearer and a crozier bearer. And they would follow this following route. They would walk down here, down the nave, to the steps here. They'd make an external procession around here. They'd come up here. they'd come in what was called the toilet corridor, they'd walk through into the back of the cathedral, along here, and into the priest's sacristy. Now, unlike all of the investigative journalists, I've walked that. It's 308 steps. Now, I'm a bit tall, so it's probably a bit more than 308 steps. But I've walked it with the man who was at the time the MC at the cathedral when the trial was going on, and it takes 4.5 minutes to do that walk. I think I've lost the... There. 4.5 minutes. Got it? Now, Pell in the record of interview. The allegations are put to him. He says, well, hang on. There's a hive of activity in that priest sacristy after the 11 a.m. Mass. He said the servers come in, the concelebrants come in, the sacristan comes in, the money counters come in. There's just all manner of people around. How could I be alone in that sacristy with 2 choir boys for what was alleged to be about a 6-minute period? And basically, at the trial, the chief police investigator, Mr. Chris Reed, he was asked, well, given what's been alleged in the priest sacristy, it had already been clarified they didn't interview anyone who was a concelebrant, they didn't interview any money counters, but there was an altar server, a man by the name of Connor, who had a book. He was anally retentive. He kept a record of every mass and every server, and then the lunches they'd go to at Jimmy Watson's and the servers who had the lunches, etc. The police had this. They did not interview one single altar server. Interviewed lots of choristers, but not a single altar server. When asked why not, the police investigator said, well, the complainant said there were none there. Now, this is basic policing. Let's take an example, nothing to do with victims of abuse. Let's say you have someone who says, I've witnessed a bank robbery and I was in the bank and I'm a pedestrian and this is what happened. And the police say, well, we'd better interview another 30 pedestrians. Did you interview any bank tellers? No, because the pedestrian said she didn't see any. But wouldn't you at least interview the bank tellers to try and find out what actually goes on inside the bank at the time it's alleged that the robbery occurred? No altar servers were interviewed. It got worse. The prosecutor was a very honourable man, and I think a good barrister, Mark Gibson. He, before the jury, said, well, look, we've got to find this 6-minute period when there's no one in the sacristy. So he said what happened was that the altar servers... Can I get back to the map? Oh, right. He said, we need that 6 or 7 minutes where there's no one else in the sacristy. He said to the jury, what happened was the 7 altar servers, they adjourned to the utility room for 7 minutes. Well, he had to correct that. There was no evidence of that. So basically the prosecution case to the jury was that for that 7 minutes the altar servers simply disappeared. They weren't to be found anywhere. Now, you who know how solemn mass works, how would 7 altar servers at that point, they come in, they bow to the crucifix, and then they disappear for 7 minutes? Where do they go? What do they do? The next issue that Pell highlighted was that it was an external procession. Now, this is the complete giveaway of the case, and basic policing should have put an end to things at this stage. You see, in the early stages of investigation, the complainant told the police...
Could we just have a little bit more volume at the back, please?
Yes. The complainant told the police that he and his friend, at the end of Mass, they did what they always did. they made an internal procession from here into the priest's sacristy, a mere 56 steps. And it made it almost comprehensive that, yes, we were doing the usual 56 steps in the internal procession, and we started fossicking around, and we found a bottle of wine in the priest's sacristy. And as the two appeal court judges in the Victorian Court of Appeal, Ferguson and Maxwell, said, in the 2016 walkthrough, which the complainant did, being filmed, Jay said that the choir would come up and down the internal sacristy corridor every Sunday before and after Mass. So it was as simple as that. That's what we always did. That's what he remembered. Pell, in the record of interview in 2016, says, no, that's not what we do. This is a solemn Mass at St Patrick's Cathedral. We do an external procession. And the senior investigator, Sheridan, brought in and said, oh, really? So he said, yeah, go back to Melbourne and, check it out. So they come back to Melbourne, and sure enough, the police satisfy themselves, yeah, it probably was an external procession. So the next time we hear from Jay is when he turns up at the committal proceedings. And he says, yes, actually it was an external procession. We came down here, up here, along here, and we're processing along this way, but by the time we got to about the south transept here, I and my mate, we spontaneously decided to split off from the procession, and we decided to come inside and then, if you like, resume the old route of the internal procession. Now that was 277 steps, okay? By the time it got to trial and he was quizzed before the jury, there was a problem. If he'd peeled off in the south transept, you've got a choir of 50, he and his mate were solo sopranos or altos, so they were at the front of the procession. There are 40 or 50 behind him, including adults, some of whom were men whose own sons were in the choir. The question was, well, surely you'd be seen, and this is a breach of discipline. You're there at the school on a scholarship. You wouldn't be doing this sort of thing. And so by the time it comes to trial and it goes before the jury, it said, oh no, we didn't come off at the south transept. We kept going all the way to the toilet corridor, round here to the toilet corridor. We got into the toilet corridor, then spontaneously, without speaking to each other, we turned around and we retraced our steps down here, in the south transept, in here and into the priest's sacristy. 408 steps. Just bear in mind, it takes 5.5 minutes, okay? That's all you need to remember at this stage. Pell, for his part, says, well, actually, I wouldn't be anywhere around there because I'd come out here and I'd be greeting people on the steps. Prosecution made a big thing of the fact, look, we concede that Pell ultimately set up a protocol that he would always be greeting people on the steps unless he had business to run off to or whatever. But these first two solemn masses as the new Archbishop in the cathedral, he wouldn't have stayed there very long. Now you've got to say, it's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? I mean, if you're given to standing on the cathedral steps, you're the new Archbishop, you're at your first two masses, chances are you'd spend more rather than less time meeting your new parishioners. And even if you tried to get away, have you ever met any of those, anxious parishioners who are very keen to meet the new priest or the new bishop? Do you think that, hey George, back here, want to meet you. Now, if in any doubt about what Pell's approach to things was then, he'd just become the Archbishop. The Melbourne Age did a 2-page spread on him, the Gospel according to Pell, at that time. And they described him attending a priest's funeral, a Chinese priest's funeral. He said after the service they spill onto the concrete outside and the older Italians line up in front of Pell to pay their respects. They reach for his hand, then bend and kiss his knuckles or his ring in an ancient gesture of homage. Some wipe away tears. Pell is unsurprised and responds to each one with a few words or a blessing. Later, when he tries to pose for a photograph, he's surrounded by a flock of giggling nonas half his size who want to get into the picture too. They're quite unembarrassed. He's their archbishop, the face of their church, and he belongs to them. This is Catholic faith in the old style, ritualised, tribalised and unquestioning. Well, if you want the old style, it's there on the steps, ritualised, tribalised and unquestioning. The next thing Pell says in the record of interview is, well, look, hang on. This is a very solemn event. I'm there with my MC, Monsignor Bortelli. He's always with me in this sort of thing. And so, once again, the prosecutor, doing a painstaking job, tries to get Bortelli out of the picture. And this was another one of those aha moments for me as a lawyer attending the proceedings. As you know, there were two trials, because in the first trial the jury couldn't agree. Gibson had to separate Pell and Bortelli with evidence which was in some way coherent. So he said, well, maybe there was some event on in the cathedral that afternoon which meant that Bortelli had to go and fix up the books on the sanctuary, so he'd be away for a couple of minutes. Well, the only event that afternoon, on either day, was the evening 5:30 Mass. Now, a suggestion was put to the jury, oh, well, maybe Pell stayed and did that Mass. There was no evidence of that. Why is there no evidence of it? Because as all of you know, if the Archbishop does the solemn Mass at 11 a.m, he doesn't traipse back to do the low Mass at 5:30 on a Sunday afternoon. But the real giveaway was this. Gibson, at both trials, says to Bortelli, you're a smoker, aren't you? So maybe while you were fully vested, you just whipped out the back and had a smoke. So you're away for 6 or 7 minutes. He put that to the jury at the first trial and had to retract it before the jury. He did it again at the second trial. Now this fellow's a QC, and as I say, he's a very honourable man, he's a good lawyer. How did he twice make that mistake? He is so desperate to find that 6 or 7 minutes to separate Pell from Bortelli, and he had to retract it. So, to conclude this part of it, we then come to the magical 6 minutes. The 6 minutes when Pell and the two boys are said to be there in the sacristy. The sacristan was a man by the name of Potter in his 80s, and by the time of the second trial, he was starting to lose it. Anyone who attended both trials knows that the great weight which was put by the DPP in the High Court and on the two appeal judges in Victoria of the majority, the great weight put on the 6 minutes was preposterous. Why? Because in the first trial, there was no mention of 6 minutes private prayer time by Potter. But he did mention it in the second trial. So let me give you exactly the question and answer that was put to him. Prosecutor, once Mass finishes and the procession commences down the nave, okay, Mass finishes, procession commences down the nave towards the west door. Once Mass finishes and the procession commences, how long is it before you first attend the sanctuary to start what you've just told us? So once it starts here, how long until you then attend to the sanctuary? Answer, could be 5 minutes. I make sure that the procession's cleared from the cathedral first, so it comes down the nave, that the whole procession's moved through and people will be walking up to the sanctuary area kneeling, so we don't disturb them for that 5 or 6 minutes. We gave them their private time and then we would move in after that. In the Court of Appeal, Justices Maxwell and Ferguson, their key paragraph was paragraph 300 of their judgment. Listen to it. It is absurd. In our view, taking the evidence as a whole, it was open to the jury to find that the assaults took place in the 5 to 6 minutes of private prayer time and that this was before the hive of activity described by the other witnesses began. The jury were not bound to have a reasonable doubt. So it happened in the 5 or 6 minutes after the first servers start down the nave. And we know it takes the first servers 4.5 minutes to get to the priest's sacristy. So 4.5 of your 6 minutes have gone before even the first server gets there. We know, according to Jay, 5.5 minutes elapse before he and his mate travel their elaborate route. So in those 6 minutes, not even Jay and his mate are in the room. And in those 6 minutes, Pell's at the back of the procession. Even if he only stayed here for 10 seconds, he's still not going to be there within 6 minutes. Absolutely impossible. If you want to know how bad the criminal justice system of Victoria has become, just consider this exchange then in the High Court of Australia, where the DPP herself appeared before all 7 judges of the highest court in the land. She comes to the 6 minutes. She says, well, I'm really going to go in hard on this and say that 6 minutes is just not something that you can be definite about, because what they say is that there's a period of a quiet interlude. Now, how long that is and when it starts is very much dependent upon how long it takes for the cathedral to be cleared. She went on to say, well, if there's a big congregation, it takes a long time for the cathedral to clear. That's not what Potter said. He said it starts here and he waits for the procession to clear before he does anything, and it takes him 4.5 minutes. Chief Justice Kiefel says to the DPP, Ms Judd, was it put to any witness that it could be more than 5 to 6 minutes? She fudges it. I won't read you the answer. Chief Justice, the question is not a difficult one, Ms Judd. Was it put to any witness that it could be more than 5 or 6 minutes? She fudges it again. The Chief Justice says, I take it the answer to my question is no. Judge says, no, but there was never any leave to cross-examine, so it was explored in an open. The Chief Justice says, but in the passages you've just taken us to, the prosecutor adopts the evidence of 5 to 6 minutes and goes with it. In the highest court of the land, the most senior prosecutor of the state of Victoria invented a theory, invented evidence. It's outrageous. And if in any doubt, you can still watch the video of it on the High Court. Just look at the look on the 7 judges of the High Court of Australia, saying, what in God's name is going on in Victoria? Well, just to conclude, this was also against a background where Victoria Police were up to no good. And if you're in any doubt about that, just look at what happened at the time that there was the Victorian Parliamentary inquiry. When Pell became the Archbishop, he negotiated a protocol with the Victoria Police and the most senior law officers of Victoria. It remained in place from 1996 to 2011, 15 years. Then there was a Victorian Parliamentary inquiry, and the Victorian Police fronted before that Victorian inquiry and said things which at the very least were not transparent. Let me simply quote what the Victorian inquiry said. It's clear that Victoria Police paid inadequate attention to the fundamental problems of the Melbourne response arrangements until relatively recently in April 2012, and that when they did become the subject of public attention, Victoria Police representatives endeavoured quite unfairly to distance the organisation from them. And the delightful centrepiece of Mr Ashton appearing before that parliamentary inquiry was to say, we've done some research and we have found that there could be up to 43 suicides which are related to clerical sexual abuse. And we'll have the results very shortly for you. That then became a big national story, and it helped fuel the call for a Royal Commission. Within less than 2 weeks, on the 1st of November, the police received an intelligence brief. I won't read it all to you, there's no time. But it turned out of the 43 cases, quote, one case had childhood sexual assault by a member of the clergy identified as a contributing factor in the motivations of the person for their death by suicide. One case. And we were not told that until 2015. Be in no doubt, Mr. Ashton's police force had a job to do, and it was to get Pell charged. And the results were what Pell predicted. So, let me conclude by saying this. What we need for the good, not just of people like Pell, but also for the good of someone like Jay, and for all bona fide complainants, all victims and their supporters, we need good policing, good basic policing. We need honourable prosecution. And if in any doubt about our legal system, then in the end be grateful that we're part of a federation and we do have the High Court of Australia. I have my own criticism to make of the High Court. I'm very critical of a judgment they gave on refugee issues this week, where they split 4-3. But here, 7-0, where they said there's just nothing in this. So the big lesson is, look, the media will continue that, all sorts of intimations about Pell's guilt or whatever. There's no doubt that he's innocent. There's no doubt that he was made a scapegoat. And there is no doubt that what we need is the Church does need the state to deal with these issues, but the state needs to act honourably and state officials need to do their job. And when they don't, everybody suffers huge and lasting trauma. Mr. J was put through 2 years of additional trauma where the most basic of policing would have put him out of his angst about all that he was then put through. And so I think these are the lessons for Church and State from the Pell saga. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Frank, for a magnificent address. I'm sure there will be a number of questions. I have a couple here from the text. This is with regards to the questionable manner in which the investigation took off, advertising for complainants. Do you believe a Royal Commission into the affair should be called? This is from CD.
No, well, there won't be any Royal Commission in Victoria on this. They've already had a Royal Commission, you might remember, into the Lawyer X inquiry. And it's been a bit of deja vu for me because I was brought up in Queensland in the early 70s when Joh Bjelke-Petersen was the Premier. And a lot of what I've seen in Victoria, it's just a replay of what I saw in Queensland in the early 70s. Queensland was right of centre, Victoria, it's left of centre. They've had a Royal Commission there into Lawyer X, where the Royal Commissioner found there are up to 1,000 or more criminal convictions which are now questionable because of the appalling behaviour of the Victoria Police in what they did with Lawyer X. The High Court of Australia once again unanimously labelled this as completely reprehensible, to which Commissioner Ashton, speaking to his favourite radio personality, said, oh yeah, well they've got their view. And the Royal Commission then said there was a need to appoint an investigator. When that happened with the Fitzgerald inquiry in Queensland, the investigator was appointed before Fitzgerald finished his work. In Victoria, it's now over 6 months since that Royal Commission reported, and there has been no investigator appointed. Mind you, there are advertisements in the national newspapers to appoint a full-time new judicial registrar of the Court of Appeal to deal just with the appeals of those who have been convicted with probably tainted evidence as a result of the activities of Victoria Police and Lawyer X. So Victoria needs to implement its present Royal Commission. Getting to a Royal Commission on this one in addition to that, I think is all but inconceivable. Basically, I think people have said, let the caravan move on. But I hope we would not see a repetition of that. And the way they advertised for people to come forward, particularly on Christmas Eve that year, I thought was an absolute disgrace.
Thank you, Father Frank. Are there any questions from the floor or written questions? I have two other text questions. Michael Pidcock.
Let me just read it out, Bill.
Yes, Michael. Yeah.
Frank, a direct question. Was Mr J coached by forces such as the police into providing his evidence?
I don't know. I haven't seen the evidence of Mr J. I operate on the presumption that he was not, but I'd have to say that, I mean, what you've seen there... Can we get back to the map?
Oh, Zachary, sorry.
Oh.
He's on the other job.
What you've seen there with the map, where it changed from 56 steps to 277 steps to 408 steps, I mean, clearly there was a lot going on, let's just say that. And I mean, the absurdity of it was that Jay, at least, and the police having been convinced that it was an external procession, I mean, one problem was, well, how do we deal with external procession and then still follow the path back here? But it created a whole new problem, namely that there just was not 6 minutes where Pell could be in the room and there wasn't 6 minutes when the two boys could be in the room, let alone 6 minutes when Pell and the two boys could be in the room alone together. Just can't be done. And if in any doubt, all I say to people nowadays is, well, look, forget about the evidence, just give us a theory. Just give us a theory. It needs 6 minutes for them to be alone in the sacristy immediately after Mass. Give us a theory as to what happens with the altar servers. Give us the theory about all of this. And no one's come up with one yet.
Thank you. I've got a written question here from Eleanor Douglas from North Perth. Is the Pell travesty a one-off, or should we interpret it as an anti-Catholic bias in the Victorian government against Catholic institutions?
I don't think it's likely that we'll have the same concatenation of circumstances ever again, where, I mean, you've got all of the horror of a Royal Commission, you've got someone like Pell who had become a lightning rod conductor, and you've got a desire by the Victorian police force to get a scalp. Now, it may be that in the future there's those sorts of risks, but that's why I keep emphasising that we've got to maintain faith, but that faith has to be deserved in our key institution, particularly policing, particularly prosecutions, and particularly appeal courts. And who'd have thought that, I mean, the mystery for me has always been, I mean, Weinberg undoubtedly was the leading criminal appeal judge in the country, and he was called back from retirement to sit on this case by the Chief Justice, who was known, and it's no criticism of her, but it's known that criminal law was not her field. Now, as I say, if it were a tax case and you're the new Chief Justice and you don't know much about tax, and you've got the leading tax lawyer of the country sitting beside you, you'd think you'd start presuming that I'll be pretty attentive to what this tax lawyer has to say. So whether that sort of thing would be repeated again, I would hope that, particularly given the way the High Court judgment deals with these things, I would think some lessons have been learnt. Just to give you one example, there's a paragraph in the High Court judgment. When the DPP, in her desperation, wanted to get the matter back to Victoria, rather than having the High Court decide it there and then, she submitted to them that they didn't have all the evidence available to make a decision, so no, why not refer it back to the Victorian Court of Appeal, or maybe bring it back here again? The High Court of Australia unanimously, all 7 judges, they quoted the submission and they said there is only one way to describe this submission, specious. Now, I know enough about how the High Court of Australia works that draft judgment sat on 7 desks, and each of them looked and said, ooh, specious, ooh, you know, it's pretty strong stuff. And each of them said, yep, specious. Now, hopefully we can avoid that sort of thing. And I want to repeat again, as I said, I think during the proceedings, the prosecutor through the trial, Gibson, I think was very honourable and did a very, workmanlike job, just did his job. But by the time it got to the High Court, you had the DPP at one stage. From the High Court, Virginia Bell said, well, what about what the prosecutor conceded on this before the jury? She threw him under the bus and said, you shouldn't have made the concession. Well, you don't do that sort of thing in the High Court of Australia.
Thank you, Father Frank. We have 2 questions from the floor, one in the other room. Could you just mention your name, please, before you put the question?
Robert Kennelly from Holy Trinity. Thanks, Father Frank, for all your work, not just on the Pell case. I believe Lindy Chamberlain probably killed Azaria, but did not think for a millisecond that she could be found guilty on the basis that there was nobody, no witness and no motive. In the Pell case, my balance left me. I was excited and pleased at the guilty verdict. It was actually weeks after your interview following the High Court appeal that rationality returned. And I realised he could not have been guilty. Any comment?
Well, my only comment is this. What I've done in the book, it's an accurate little book of reportage of every interview I gave and every article I wrote. And they're there in chronological order. And you might remember when I wrote that first article in The Australian, I copped quite a thrashing. I would still say, going back and looking at that article today, I wouldn't change a word of it. And I think in light of the High Court decision, I think a lot of people who were critical of me then might have cause to look again at what was being said. Now, very deliberately, I decided that after the suppression order was lifted, I would write 1 and only 1 article and do 3 and only 3 interviews. 2 of the 3 were with the ABC, 7:30 and the Drive program in Melbourne. I then made it clear I would not speak again until the legal processes had run their course. I thought it was not proper for someone like myself, with a profile as I have, to be buying into a public debate until everything had run its course in the courts. And then, when the High Court gave its decision, I then wrote 3 or 4 articles and I gave only 1 interview. And I very deliberately did not give that interview to the ABC because I thought that the ABC by that time had not conducted itself in a dispassionate professional manner, and I thought them calling me in at that stage, as they wanted to, would be simply the old game of, well, let's now restore balance. Well, I'm not in the game of hanging around just to restore balance when there's that sort of media reporting going on. So my comment would be that it's very necessary for us to be respectful of legal processes, but then let's actually do the hard work of looking at the evidence and then identifying the problems that are there. It is extraordinary in Australia at the moment that, if it were a 4-3 or 5-2 decision of the High Court, you might say, well, maybe there's something in this. But that it's 7-zip and that it's written in the way that it is very clear that the High Court was of the view that this was not a case which should have proceeded as it had.
Thank you. There's two questions here. Firstly, Lindsay, and then across to the other table.
Lindsay Road from St Thomas More Parish. Thank you. What you've said is that Cardinal Pell has received justice. Is it possible for Jay to receive justice?
Father Frank, could you just repeat the bullet points of Lindsay's
Said
question
that
for the purposes of
Cardinal
the
Pell
last
has received justice. Is it possible for Jay to receive justice? I mean, the tragedy is we don't know what's happened to Jay. We do know this. There's no way that what he said occurred when and when he said it, where and when he said it. No way known. Just impossible. So, and given the changes of thinking that went on, there were obviously all sorts of mental processes at play. Now, I mean, we do know from some of the records that he says that he suffered abuse when he was a young boy by someone who was child-minding at his home, and that he was abused by, he says, by his parish priest when he was a young altar server. Now, this is, of course, a whole other scenario. In terms of justice for Jay, what I've been arguing tonight is that justice for Jay would have been, look, what does it mean when the Prime Minister says in the apology, "We believe you"? It means this: Jay, we respect you, and we will take on board absolutely everything you say, and we will do thoroughly professional police work, and the prosecution will do thoroughly professional prosecution work, determining whether your case should be pursued. Now, with quite a number of the Ballarat ones, that was done, and the cases quite rightly were thrown out. You might remember, it was in the media at the time. There were allegations that Pell had, raped a child while watching a movie in the picture theatre. And, well, it was demonstrated that, amongst other things, the kid said he had a vivid memory of what the movie was. Well, the movie wasn't showing at that time. And that the fellow who ran the movie theatre said that if this had been going on in his movie theatre, he would have known something about it. So justice for that person meant, look, we don't know what's happened in your life, but this is not a case to be prosecuted where there would be risks to everyone, yourself included. So I would say that justice for Jay would be that with the sort of basic police work that should have been done after the record of interview of Pell, it should have been, this is not an appropriate case to go forward. The other thing to say is this: even the committing magistrate said, look, if you were to believe Portelli and Potter, then there's no way that Pell could be guilty. Now, and a lot of people don't appreciate this, the prosecution, because they were calling 23 witnesses, 22 of whom would have been those who worked around the church or whatever, the prosecution was given permission in relation to a number of them, including Portelli and Potter, that they would be allowed to cross-examine them, basically to question their honesty or credibility or recall, even though they were their own witness, the prosecution witness. So the prosecution went to the trouble of getting that permission and never exercised it. Now, you're left with a case where the committing magistrate says, well, if Portelli and Potter are believed, there's no way Pell can be guilty. You've got permission to cross-examine Portelli and Potter to say, this is bunkum, and you don't, then sure. But that then leaves us, and let's make no mistake for us as church. And it's what I said in the first 7:30 interview the night after the lifting of the suppression order. The truly dreadful thing that we all have to accept as Catholics in contemporary Australia is that 12 presumably decent Aussies off the street sat through all this and said, bugger it, we're going to slot him. And I think you can see here tonight that there's no way you could slot anyone on this unless there is a collective mindset that, you know, we want to slot this bugger for something, and we're slotting him for this. But it was wrong.
Thank you. Zachary, the microphone, the gentleman in front of you.
Hi, Peter Collier from Holy Trinity Parish. It's a general question about what the role of judges are in this whole justice system. My understanding is if you get convicted or to get convicted in a criminal prosecution, it's got to be beyond reasonable doubt. A civil case, it's got to be probable. And if it's just possible, it shouldn't wash, you know, even at that lower level. And it struck me that, you know, well, at least maybe it's my own bias, this never even got up to much past the possible. You can never say 0 or 2. But does a judge have some duty then to direct the jury or make some comments? It strikes me as the judge had a role here, didn't it?
No, in some jurisdictions the judge does, but in
Father
Victoria...
Frank, can you just hit the couple of bullet points on that?
So the question is, well, a case like this, you probably couldn't even satisfy the civil level that, you know, on the balance of probabilities. Does the judge have a role to play in saying this should not go ahead? In some jurisdictions the judge does have a role, but not in Victoria. In Victoria, once the prosecution, and this is why the role of DPP is so important, once the prosecution is on foot, the judge is basically powerless other than just to let the thing run its course. Now, we'll never know what Justice Kidd thought, who was the trial judge. I always thought that, like his final charge to the jury, I thought was a very light touch sort of charge, and I came away thinking that he probably thinks this isn't going to go anywhere in terms of conviction. But I may be quite wrong on that. But, I mean, for example, he managed to do his final charge without even mentioning a mitre or a crozier. Well, if Pell turns up at the pre-sacristy without a mitre or a crozier, that's actually evidence, I think, that he must have been out there on the steps, because it's only if he leaves the procession and stays on the steps for a considerable period of time that he'll hand over the mitre and the crozier to the mitre bearer and the crozier bearer, who will go ahead. But those things were left untouched in the final charge. And in fact, even in with this about the different routes, I might just quote it from the book. This will give you an idea of how light his touch was on it all. I'm not being critical of him, I'm just saying that it was a light touch final charge. This is what the trial judge said to the jury. It does seem common ground, however, between the parties that there are some differences in Jay's account. In relation to the first episode concerning the pre-sacristy, at the committal, Mr. J drew a diagram on the cathedral plan showing the way he left the procession and veered off at the south transept in the doors. Right? There is that line which shows veering off from the procession not far from the south transept and into the south transept. At trial, he said they went up to the toilet corridors near the iron gate and double back. So that's a difference. It seems common ground that there's a difference there, and both parties made arguments to you about what flows from that. I haven't even dealt tonight with the fifth charge, which, if you think these four charges were preposterous, the fifth charge was just interplanetary stuff. It was that, you know, Pell was standing next to Father Brendan Egan, who'd said the Mass. At the end of the Mass, they're all in a corridor, probably 40 or 50 people there. Pell peels off, goes off in the midst of all these people, puts the kid against the wall, assaults him, and then comes back and joins the procession. And guess what? The police to this day, have never spoken to Brendan Egan. Now, he did leave the priesthood, but he's been working for a local council in Victoria, readily contactable, never spoken to by the police. And you put that charge against a citizen who happens to be George Pell. Ridiculous.
Another question over there, Michael Lee.
Michael Lee, Principal of McKillop. There was a variety of opinions expressed in the politics and religion class of Year 11 at Cardinal about the the prosecution of Cardinal Pell's defence, choice of lawyer, refusal or choosing not to take the stand, etc. What do you think about some of those decisions, and do you think that put the Cardinals best foot forward?
Right. Well, I don't mind saying, because it's not a claim of hindsight, and to be fair and gracious to Cardinal Pell, he acknowledges this in his prison diary. After the first trial, when he didn't give evidence, I wrote to him telling him he must give evidence. And I went to see him, and I had a long talk with him. And I fronted up for the second trial, and I wasn't part of Team Pell or whatever, so I was in the dark as much as anyone. It seemed to me that Richter was upping the ante a bit in the second trial, and I thought, oh, something going on here, but I thought, but that's okay, Pell's going to give evidence this time. The first time my heart sank was then at the end of the prosecution case when it was announced that Pell was not giving evidence. And there's a saying in the law, using an American term, we don't want Monday morning quarterbacks. That is, after the game, everyone's an expert and says, well, that went wrong, so you should have done something different. I remain convinced, as I was between the first and second trial, that basically, and I don't think the criminal lawyers had got this, I think they would in future. Criminal lawyers, they're very good at acting within the box. But I think in this case, it had reached the stage in the Australian public mind where I think ordinary decent jurors said, we're sick to death of the Catholic Church spending big money to employ flash lawyers who cross-examine the complainant for 2 days or whatever, and then this guy, who's obviously very bright and all the rest of it, doesn't even get in the box and eyeball us and tell us there's no way that could have happened. Now, I may well be wrong, but I think one of the lessons out of the Pell saga is that if there is a prominent church person in that sort of position in future, then basically you've got to front the jurors. You've got to eyeball your fellow citizens, and you've got to say, no way.
Thank you. I have a question here from George Christensen MP. The Pell case shows without a doubt that there is active discrimination in our institutions, namely police and judiciary, against Catholic clergy. Given this, Father Frank, what do you think would be the bare minimum that needs to be done with the Federal Religious Discrimination Bill or otherwise to ensure this is a true religious liberty and true non-discrimination against people of faith in Australia? George rephrased this question a couple of times to bring it back to the case. Thank you. Right.
Well, George, I'll be happy to come and see you in your office at some time and talk about these things. I've always had a rule. I chaired the inquiry for the Rudd government on national human rights. I was then on the committee Turnbull set up on religious freedom, chaired by Ruddick. And I've had a rule to myself that if you work on a committee like that, you do your report, you put it in, and you let it speak for itself. So that's been my approach. And one reason I've had that approach is that years ago, there was a judge of whom I thought very highly, Justice Lockhart, though I disagreed with him on things to do with stem cell research or whatever, and he did a major inquiry on stem cell research, and I think he died or was unwell or whatever. Well, then some of the public servants and others who'd been involved in the inquiry evangelised very strongly for it, and I just didn't think that was right. I think, very appropriate. Any member of Parliament wants to talk to me about these things, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to be evangelising that cause or whatever. But I will say this, that yes, I became convinced in 2009 that Australia does need something like an overarching Human Rights Act, but that is not the will of our major political parties at this stage. The track we've gone down in Australia is with a whole bevy of discrimination laws, racial discrimination, age discrimination, etc. Given that that's the track we've gone down, I think there is a prima facie case for having a religious discrimination law, that you shouldn't discriminate against people on the basis of religion. But where it becomes highly problematic is this, that in a Religious Discrimination Act you would need far more exemptions than you would in other sorts of discrimination laws. Why? Because religious people want to be able to choose people of their own religion for particular functions for very understandable reasons. And the thing about religion is that if I'm a Christian, I actually believe that Jesus Christ is the Saviour. I actually believe that Christianity is the best religion. If I'm a Muslim, I don't believe Christianity is the best religion. I believe Islam is the best religion. Now, in that sort of situation, I think the work to be done by a discrimination law is very different from what it is in things like race discrimination, age discrimination. So there are many complexities in all of that. Having said that, I think what's essential is to ensure that within our public institutions that there is no discrimination, including religious discrimination. And it would be absolutely appalling if there were ongoing discrimination against Catholics by a particular state police force. I think it's no secret that, clearly there was an antipathy or a strong difference between George Pell as a leading Catholic and Graham Ashton as the Victorian Police Commissioner. But hopefully we can all move on from the sorts of abuses which occurred during the Pell proceedings.
Thank you, Father Frank. We're coming to the end of question time, but I have one here from Rizbar Jarvis. I think the jury did want Pell to be responsible for child sex offences within the church. I agree that Pell, in the criminal sense, is not guilty. But who in the church will take responsibility for the abhorrent treatment of children? Until responsibility is taken, the church has a problem with the public.
I readily concede that, and that's why I started with the quotes from Cardinal Marx and from Pope Francis. In Pell's defence and the church defence, I would say this. I think, the Royal Commission did a lot of good work, but where I think the follow-up on the Royal Commission has not been good is I think there was insufficient acknowledgement that the Catholic Church had done a lot of work since 1996 to get its house in order. There were still failures, but there was a lot of work that was done in order to get that house in order. And I think part the problem has been that where you have particularly some in the media who say, oh no, the Catholic Church is a complete cot case on all of this, there are people in the church who have sweated long and hard between 1996 and 2021, which is 25 years, who feel, well, how can we ever get it right? Now, definitely, some of those people would simply say, well, the sooner the Catholic Church goes away, the better. Well, as we know, the Catholic Church isn't going to go away, but what we do want to ensure is that, yes, we do have the appropriate accountabilities.
Okay, we've got time for only 2 questions from the floor. If you could keep them short, we're over time. And just put your name together with the question, thank you.
My name is Gabriel Jarvis, and
Where's
during this course of the George Pell inquiry, I was told by 2 different people in totally different walks of life that some people had been doing research in America and they heard about this setup, and almost word for word, witness Jay's words came exactly from what was reported to be done about 100 years ago in America. Do you know anything about it, and do you believe it?
I don't know anything about it, so I'm not in a position to believe it or not believe it. Yeah.
Thank you. Final question. Okay, that's it. So, sorry. Is there one more question, Zachary?
Got one more question.
Wendy Rowe from Ballylong. When Cardinal Pell gave an interview to the ABC a few months ago, one of his comments was he felt that Jay had been got at by the Vatican. Comments on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this has been one of the very unfortunate things. If there had been better policing, better prosecution, better work by the Victorian Court of Appeal, we would all be spared these conspiracy theories about Vatican money and Witness J. Now, who knows, but I would still be very surprised, and as on all of these things, I say, let's wait and see the evidence. And that's exactly what I tried to do during the course of the Pell trials. Let's see the evidence and let's apply the appropriate standard of proof. Now, for my money, everything else simply remains surmise or conspiracy theories. And I remember once, I don't think he'd mind my saying this, Cardinal Pell said to me, because he said to me about some of the intrigues going on in the Vatican, and I said to him, look, I'm one of those Jesuits, I take no notice whatever of these intrigues in the Vatican. It would simply be a threat to my faith. And he said to me, well, someone like yourself should be interested and should be involved. But to this date, I find that I have more than enough things to interest me and more than enough things to do without trying to get on top of the intrigues of Vatican finances.
On that note, would you thank Father Frank Brennan for his wonderful address?
Thank you.
There were still questions flowing through, but we just can't take them all, I'm sorry. It's my pleasure now to invite Joanne Gale to move the vote of thanks on behalf of our parish and the audience. Thanks, Jo.
Good evening, everyone. It might bring me bad luck to quote a saint other than St Thomas More at the St Thomas More Forum, but I'm going to do it anyway. In the words of St Ambrose, no duty is more urgent than returning thanks. And so it's my privilege to say a few words of thanks on behalf of the St Thomas More Parish. My name is Joanne, I'm a member of the Parish Council, and my legal expertise consists of watching British police dramas. And I was therefore pleasantly surprised that I could follow Father Frank's presentation, and I suspect this is due to his talent of explaining complex processes and issues in such a way that even consumers of lowbrow television such as myself can understand. Father Frank's presence at the trials, his scrutiny of the court transcripts and evidence, and his presentations of his findings in the media, in his book, and here with us tonight, give all of us an important opportunity to deepen our knowledge and understanding of this very complex chapter in the Australian Catholic Church, indeed in Australia's history. He has thoughtfully and carefully presented his analysis, always with empathy for the parties involved. From the start of this whole episode, he's been a consistent and constant voice, asking for people to examine the facts in the context of very courageous stance. Father Frank's calls for truth, justice, and healing echo loud and clear. My husband Ross and I live in a household with 2 boys under the age of 4, and therefore spend a shockingly disproportionate amount of time talking about superheroes. Superheroes are seekers of truth, justice, and above all, they're compassionate and courageous. Now, while Father Frank might not wear his undergarments on the outside of his clothing, he'd come pretty close to a superhero classification in our household. Father Frank, as a Catholic community gathered here this evening, we're all very grateful for your efforts to seek truth and justice for all involved, including the Church. We thank you for writing the book so that we may learn from your insights, and we thank you for your generosity in sharing your journey here with us tonight. We've got a small token for you on behalf of the parish. Bill Mason will complete our list of thank yous for tonight, but Bill will not thank Bill, and tonight would not have happened without Bill. He and his family are stalwarts of the St Thomas More Parish and Forum. If the parish were a mafia organisation, they would be the top lieutenants. They just get things done, but without the violence, of course. Their commitment to the parish and the wider Catholic community is inspirational. So thanks Bill, Maria, Zach, Zane, Zara and Zoe. I'd also like to thank all of you for braving nefarious germs, icy wet weather and Canberra drivers to be here with us tonight and hear Father Frank's message. Your support of the St Thomas More Forum is very much appreciated. So the only thing left to say is good luck in the raffle. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. We'll take a short break, so enjoy your dessert. Father Frank enjoying his cold stuff.